Now, this might sound strange coming from me, but you know you don't have to write, right? Like, it's optional. Well, let me show you what I mean. So, long ago, when I was in elementary school, the big standardized tests rolled around once a year. And inevitably, that meant writing essays in response to soul-desiccating prompts. Sometimes those prompts were more personal. They were asking us to share stories or things from our own lives. But see, I was not going to play along. Part of it was because I just didn't take the test seriously, and even then, I also thought that it would be more fun to subvert the genre of the standardized essay test than to play it straight. But it was also because I was then even more uncomfortable writing and talking about myself than I am now. So when the state asked me to write an essay about someone in my life whom I admired, I promptly made up a fictional best friend named Robert who always stood up for his beliefs. And when the state asked me another year to write about my favorite memory, I fabricated a treasured trip into the woods with my uncle to go bow hunting. Never mind that I had never touched a bow in my life up to that point. Now, I knew that they weren't assessing for truth, so I figured it didn't matter what I actually wrote as long as I spelled words correctly and included good topic sentences. And see, that was a situation where I did have to write. The government demanded prose, and I provided it, however insincerely.
Of course, I only met you after you lost your spine.
Well, speaking of, years later, and actually just a little after we met, Bud, I was in poetry school attending a party with other poets, and one of them asked the group, "What are you avoiding writing about that you know you should?" And every single one of us had an answer to that question. There was something that each of our collections needed that we were avoiding.
Well, sounds like you had to write them. What even is your thesis, Bud?
Well, I'm getting there in my own good time.
And that's why our first 30-second retention curves all show precipitous drops.
Well, but isn't that just human nature?
Not alone.
Well, fine. The point is that I bet each of you watching also has something that you know you need to write, but that you're avoiding. And how do I know that? Well, because I've worked with many of you on your writing over the last couple of years. And the link is in the description, by the way, if you're interested. But along the way, I've seen dozens of poems that run right up alongside a weighty issue, but then retreat from it just as quickly. And I've seen dozens more that bury their point in layers of convoluted and obfuscating metaphor. And it's not just poems. We could also talk about essays that dance around the issue at their heart and make such a dedicated study of tangents that you'd think this show were called Trigonometry with Andrew.
Couldn't be a worse show.
Well, but here's the thing. You, dear friend, do not have to write anything. If you never write that poem about your breakup or write that essay about your crisis of faith in college, guess what? No one will ever know.
Oh, so not trigonometry, but now it's stop writing with Andrew?
Well, it would seem like that, but no. This is actually, in maybe a counterintuitive way, the exact realization I had when I was thinking about the poems that I was avoiding. It is literally true that nobody else was telling me I had to. My poetry school thesis was not like the state standardized exam for fourth graders. Nobody would know if those thorny personal poems never made it in. Nobody was giving me a specific prompt besides just asking for a certain number of pages. See, with the state exam, I had to write something. So my solution was to be squirrely and make up nonsense rather than answer an actual essay prompt about my own positive memories that were nobody's business. Because I had to write, because I was backed into a state-mandated corner, I was only left to fabricate and obfuscate in order to survive. But if writing is optional, if you really don't have to write, well then the calculus can be different.
So not trigonometry. Pick a lane, Bud.
Really, I think there are at least 3 conclusions you can draw when you realize that you don't have to write. The first is, obviously, just don't write the thing. There are some stories that don't need to be told. There are confessions that don't need to be made, and there are poems that, frankly, the world is going to be just fine without. And there could be various reasons for that. At different times in my life, for example, I've had people tell me stories and then tell me not to share them. And of course I haven't, but I also haven't tried to get those people to turn those experiences into memoirs. Sometimes things are just for you. Maybe they're stories that you tell a close friend or a confession you make to a trusted relative, but they're just not meant to be literary material. Once when I was in poetry school, a writer visited and did a series of workshops. We had read this writer's book before, and when I say that it was full of personal and intimate stuff, I mean, whoa. If you were just asking me, I'd probably argue that a lot of it crossed the line of good taste, but my own opinion aside, this was a celebrated award-winning writer. My point is not that writers should button their jackets and be respectable. My point is that because we so often celebrate writers who are so confessional and revealing, new writers might get the idea that being a writer means talking about the most intimate things. Some writers have made careers revealing more about themselves than you will ever feel comfortable revealing about yourself. And guess what? you don't have to write. You could be a contemporary confessional poet if you want, but you don't have to be. There's still plenty of room for poems about trees and lakes in your grandfather's boots. You don't have to write about your mother's depression or your cousin's addiction or your own lactose intolerance. So if you don't want to, just don't. And that's totally okay. A lot of poets don't write sonnets, and a lot of poets don't write confessional poems. It's okay sometimes to just leave things in your diary. But knowing that you don't have to write anything can also give you permission to tell yourself that you don't have to write about it yet. I remember hanging out with a bunch of young essayists, and inevitably, in those situations, the conversation often turned to asking whether young people can even write nonfiction. How do you write an essay or a memoir if you haven't lived long enough to experience things, and then process those experiences and look back on them with earned wisdom? Now, obviously, good writing is not age-gated, but the question does point to a valuable reminder. Trying to write about something too soon can cause problems. Sometimes in my own classes, for example, students will attempt to write an essay about something like the car accident they were in last week. And I think there is a certain cathartic value for them in expressing what it was like to be in that accident. But for the reader, the essay really offers little more than a description of what happened. The writer just hasn't had any time to process that crash or to draw any insights out of it. So, for however vivid the description might be because it's fresh, the piece doesn't offer much more beyond a description, because the writer hasn't found any meaning in the experience beyond, "I'm so glad I walked away uninjured." And again, that's wonderful and valuable and important in a human sense, but literarily, it's not the most satisfying conclusion. Right? You can write whatever you want, whenever you want. But if you're planning to write literature, if you're planning to write for readers, well, then your readers are going to want more than a diary entry. And sometimes there's benefit in letting your experiences ferment a while before you try to put them out there. Like sometimes when I'm feeling overwhelmed by the far too many things I've committed myself to do, I'll just grab a piece of paper and dump whatever's in my head. Usually, about 3 pages in, my thoughts have calmed down, I've drawn out some insights, and I know what I'm going to do for the rest of the afternoon, but that's not an essay for readers, it's not even an outline for an essay. When you're in the middle of something, writing can serve a different purpose, and it can still be a valuable purpose, but it might not be that valuable for a reader. So, because you don't have to write, it's okay to set things aside for now. When I look back on my experiences during the pandemic, for example, I know there's probably a whole book of poems in there, but I also know that I'm frankly just not quite ready to write about most of it. It's still doing whatever it's doing in my subconscious. Other things don't take as long to process, so I'm not going to tell you when it's time to write about something or when it isn't. I just want to say that if you're having a hard time writing about some experience, that's okay. You don't have to. Give it some time. You can always write about it later. And finally, my own actual realization in school led me to this conclusion. If I don't have to write, then when I do write, I owe it to myself and my subject and my reader to actually write and not just half write. Think about it. If the world will keep turning, whether you write your poem about your broken heart or not, then what good are you really doing anyone by burying your broken heart poem under layers of distracting metaphors, squirrely circumlocutions, and invulnerable to inference implications? You don't have to write. So if you're going to write, just write the darn thing. What good does it do you to write around what you have to say? What good does it do your reader when your work gives them a treasure chest of literary truth, but you've withheld the key? How does it honor your experience when you talk about it in such a way that you are actually withholding it? If you've decided that what you have to say is something you want to say, and you've processed it enough to have something interesting to say about it, well, then there's no reason not to just say the thing. Half saying it only does everyone a disservice. In part, I was led to this realization by a teacher who occasionally encouraged us to take risks in our writing. But whenever he did, he'd add, risk. In some places, you can go to jail for writing poems. Now, writing a poem or essay or story can feel like an awfully vulnerable thing, but it's worth remembering that the scale of risk is usually a lot smaller than it might seem. Now, this might feel tangential, but one time years ago, I was in the hospital with my grandfather. A surgeon came in and explained to him what was going to have to happen if my grandfather was going to get better. And understandably, after the surgeon explained that they were going to cut him open, dig around through his organs, and rearrange some things, my grandfather was a little hesitant to give an enthusiastic go-ahead for the procedure. And I still remember the almost contemptuous impatience that the surgeon had for my grandfather. My grandfather wasn't especially excited about undergoing an invasive surgery, and the surgeon, like some kind of lizard robot, was just irritated with him. And sure, I get it. For the surgeon, it was just another day at work. But for my grandfather, it was a massive, probably terrifying proposition. Now, I do think that surgeon handled the whole thing abysmally. But I also understand why the surgery just didn't seem like that big of a deal to him, because to him, it genuinely wasn't. And in the end, I guess it really wasn't, because the surgery happened and worked out just fine. But this is the actual point. When you write something a little more sensitive, you're probably feeling like my grandfather did. You're exposing yourself in a way that you've never exposed yourself before. You've thought about this difficult memory plenty of times, but what do you mean you're actually going to commit it to paper and share it with the world? That's huge. That's terrifying. What will your mother think? So you write your essay and you publish it, and you wonder if you'll ever be able to show your face in public again. And meanwhile, your readers, who have read a million essays and have seen it all, are maybe a little like that surgeon, and they're looking at you and wondering when the embarrassing part was supposed to start. And maybe that's the craziest way to make this point, or maybe the craziness is part of the point. Surgery can be a huge deal to a patient and not such a big deal to a surgeon. Writing a piece that you don't have to write, but that you feel in your bones that you want to, even though it's scary, is a big deal to you, especially the first time you do it. But it's just not that big of a deal to your readers, though. For one, if they've read a lot, they're used to it. And for two, they've got their own stuff that they aren't writing about, so it's not like they're living perfect little lives and they're looking at you as the one solitary mess in the world. No, if anything, they're just relieved to see it's not just them. So write the thing. You don't have to, but you'll probably do a lot more good in the world if you actually do it and build those bonds of solidarity with readers than if you dance around a piece that nobody forced you to write in the first place. Because really that's it, right? By dodging your subject, you're ultimately dodging your reader. And what do we need more than the reassuring reminder that there are other people out there just doing their best to live life too? So write the thing if you're going to go to the trouble, and be encouraged by the fact that it might just be exactly what your reader needs to hear. And really, we could keep talking, but I bet you've got something you could be writing. So get to it, take good care, and we'll see you again soon.